Merci beaucoup,
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Today to speak to the Conservative Opposition Day motion on the Kinder Morgan pipeline. I'll also be talking about sustainability, because I just heard the minister responsible for natural resources try to appropriate to himself the teachings of First Nations. He should learn one thing, that the First Nations are opposing Kinder Morgan because it is not a sustainable project, Madam Speaker. Now, it's worth reminding ourselves what sustainability is. Going back, well, more than 20 years now, when we got the first report that said we've got to start looking at the environmental, social, and economic aspects of all projects. What we were essentially saying is that we have to remove one of the last remaining huge inequalities in our society, which is the inequality between generations. You see, what the minister is trying to support and defend today is precisely the type of development that we had in this country over the centuries, where you take raw natural resources, you don't add value here in Canada, and you try to ship them out as quickly as you possibly can. So when I heard the government yesterday saying, well, you know, the real problem is right now we're shipping our raw petroleum resources to the United States in a far too great proportion, what we've got to do is start shipping them off to the Asian continent in just as rapidly as we were doing to the United States. They forget the obvious thing, that when we're talking about replacing some of the fossil fuels that we're burning now, those very same products can produce some of the ingredients for the sustainable future. In other words, whether it's the epoxies or the carbon substances that will go into solar panels or into the propellers for wind turbines. These are all things that require us to learn how to be prudent with all of our resources, including the oil that we're blessed with in this country. And I don't think that that statement is one that anyone would ever oppose. We are blessed in Canada to have this type of natural resource. Countries around the world realize just how lucky we are. But the
problem, Madam Speaker, and I remember that there was a time when we were opposing the closure of the Shell refinery in Montreal. At that time, people looked at me and said, well, you're an environmentalist, so how is it that you want to keep a Shell refinery in Montreal? Well, I was very happy when Louis-Gilles Francoeur, the best journalist to ever have written about the environment in Quebec, wrote a front-page story in Le Devoir defending our position and saying that, indeed, we need to stop this ridiculousness of exporting the raw version of our natural resource. And so rather than exporting raw cedar from BC to China so that it can be processed into products that we buy, made in China products that we buy in Costco, why don't we add value here in Canada? Quebec banned this type of export of raw wood long ago, but we can see that there are furniture manufacturing plants just across the border. So if we want to do well, we need to add value to our products here in Canada. And that's something that neither the Conservatives nor the Liberals have ever had as a priority.
Of course, that the Conservatives are going to put forward a motion in favor of Kinder Morgan. They don't like it when we remind them that they used a technique of budget bills that used to hide all sorts of things, that they gutted key century-old legislation like the Navigable Waters Protection Act. But what's even more disturbing, Madam Speaker, is that I was there the night that that mammoth budget bill was going through. It was hiding all sorts of things, and I remember the Liberals rending their garments, saying how terrible it was, promising up and down that they would bring back the Navigable Waters Protection Act. If we understand that we are blessed with these natural resources, then we have to understand that the only way that they can be developed with people on side, what we sometimes call social license, is to have a clear, credible, thorough, transparent environmental assessment process. But what the Conservatives did is they showed a bit of frustration. While there were too many decisions of the courts according the rights to First Nations to have a word to say about how resources were developed, after 400 years of colonialization and oppression, I think it was about time that we started giving First Nations the proper hearing and respecting their rights. Conservatives didn't agree with that. The Liberals, the whole time, talked a good game, and it's really worth looking at the words that were used by the Liberals because they can't weasel away from those right now. The Prime Minister's approval of the process that he once condemned is for us a fundamental breach of his obligation towards British Columbians and to all Canadians. In Esquimalt, BC on August 20th, 2015, the Liberal leader was asked, the now Prime Minister was asked, does your NEB overhaul apply to Kinder Morgan? He replied, yes. Yes, it applies to existing projects, existing pipelines as well. Then he was asked for further clarification. So, if they approve Kinder Morgan in January, you're saying, and then the Prime Minister cut him off. No, they're not going to approve it in January because we're going to change the government, and that process has to be redone. The tape of that is easy to find, Madam Speaker. The Liberal MP for North Vancouver and the Parliamentary Secretary to Minister of the Environment proclaimed on his campaign website, quote, a new, independent, evidence-based process must be established. The Kinder Morgan expansion project must satisfy this new rigorous review. The Liberal MP for Burnaby North Seymour, who is now the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Science, of all things, told voters, quote, we're going to redo the National Energy Board process and that Kinder Morgan will have to go through a new revised process. That was a solemn promise. They broke that promise. You were, of course, right under the rules of this Parliament, Madam Speaker, to remind us that there are certain words that we can't use in here. But I can tell you that they did not keep that promise, that what they said was not true. It was the opposite of the truth. And I can use the word to describe when somebody intentionally says the opposite of the truth. I can and will use that word the rest of the day when I speak to people outside of this hall. Because it is important to remind Canadians how we got here. We got here with Conservatives who, famously, Mr. Harper said that Kyoto, which sought to deal with the real crisis that is global warming, was, quote, a socialist plot to suck money from wealth-producing countries, unquote. That was at least an honest expression on the part of a climate change denier. What we have over on this side, and it's interesting because the head of the Green Party just used similar terms to describe it, we have the smiling version of Stephen Harper. We have the reassuring version. We have the snake oil salesman version, in fact, because throughout the campaign, they promised to do politics differently. They promised to bring back the Navigable Waters Protection Act. Of course, they haven't brought back a single article. They promised to bring in a new environmental assessment process. Of course, they broke that promise. What the Minister of Natural Resources was referring to before was something that even the people who were put on that panel after, as some sort of a patch job, said they don't even have records of anything that they heard. He had the nerve to stand in this House a few minutes ago and say, hey, all is well. We received 10,000 emails. What does that even mean, Madam Speaker? They're trying to snow people. They're trying to con people into believing that they're somehow different. The only difference is that instead of approving Kinder Morgan with a scowl, they're approving Kinder Morgan with a smile. It's still Kinder Morgan, Madam Speaker. People of British Columbia can't be fooled on that one. On the subject of what's often referred to as social license, let's be clear. The process did not allow people to even cross-examine witnesses. Now, why is that important? Well, because all of these types of approaches, this type of tribunal, this type of hearing, has to follow what are called the rules of natural justice. On est en train de voir qu'à travers le...
We're seeing that all across Canada, big energy projects are no longer being analyzed in a credible way that the public can really trust. They can't trust that this is being done properly. Now, if you have stakeholders presenting an argument, you should be able to ask them questions to interrogate them. Well, what happened in the case of Kinder Morgan? People representing Kinder Morgan were allowed to come to give their opinion, and then rather than saying that this was an opinion, they said, no, this is proof, this is evidence, these are facts. But they can't be proof or facts if we're not even allowed to ask them questions about their testimony. There was no interrogation. So this is a violation of the laws of natural justice. But the minister is trying to say that this isn't the case, is trying to make us believe that the process has been changed. But there are rules concerning sustainable development. When I was the Minister of the Environment in Quebec, I put a moratorium, a 10-year moratorium on seismic testing in the St. Lawrence Gulf. Once that moratorium was over, there were seismic tests done for Energy East, a different pipeline, and that was done in an area where there was a beluga pod living. It's unbelievable. With the help of provisions that I brought forward in Quebec's laws, in the Sustainable Development Act that I presented and that was unanimously adopted in Quebec, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Quebec was changed. Now, my colleague for Edmonton Strathcona is proposing something similar here in the House of Commons. She's proposing that we change Canadian law to give people the right to live in a safe environment within the framework of existing laws. The Suzuki framework allowed us to use the provision of the Quebec Charter to end seismic testing near this beluga whale population because belugas are already an endangered species in the St. Lawrence Gulf. But in this case, whether we're talking about Kinder Morgan or Energy East, how can the public trust the process?
Worth remembering that if you go to Quebec City, you will see very large crude carriers right across from Quebec City at the big Valero refinery there. If you go to Sorel-Tracy, you will see even larger crude carriers filling up with the new Enbridge Line 9B that was recently installed there. It's so dangerous what they're doing, and it's so obviously dangerous that those crude carriers are only allowed to fill up to a certain level because they're so close to the bottom of the St. Lawrence Seaway itself. Now, between a train, a pipeline, and one of those very large crude carriers dumping in that ecosystem in the St. Lawrence, I know which one is more dangerous. And I also know that it has to be studied because it doesn't make any sense right now in Canada that we're importing crude from insecure foreign sources like Algeria and Russia and having it refined there at Valero's large refinery in Saint-Romuald across from Quebec City. But we can't even have that discussion because neither Kinder Morgan nor Energy East can go forward because there is no thorough, credible evaluation process for that type of project in Canada right now, Madam Speaker. And the reason we don't have that project is that the Liberal government and the Liberal Prime Minister broke their word, Madam Speaker. Recent spills have demonstrated that BC is not prepared to deal with current traffic, much less with a 7-fold increase in tanker traffic. BC's coast and economy are too important to risk. That's why we're demanding a new comprehensive review process, exactly what they promised, but they haven't delivered, that addresses environmental concerns, properly consults with First Nations, fully evaluates regional economic impacts, and allows for full public participation. And I go back to the words of the member from Winnipeg who reminded us that he had played some kind of role that he claims with regard to sustainable development in the past. That makes it even more unpardonable, because he doesn't even have the excuse of ignorance, that he is claiming to have social license to go forward with Kinder Morgan. He has no such social license. His government has no such social license. We're also demanding that review process that addresses those environmental concerns and also properly consults with First Nations, fully evaluates regional economic impacts, and allows for full public participation, and as the only way to obtain that social license. Pre-election, the Prime Minister knew that. It's too bad that this post-election Prime Minister won't admit it. En vertu du processus.
Under Stephen Harper's National Energy Board process, the public was excluded, with hundreds of applications to provide comment rejected. As I said earlier, there was no ability to cross-examine witnesses. Important questions were ignored, including climate impacts, and there was no adequate consultation with First Nations. So even the government's own ministerial panel on the project criticized the significant gaps in the NEB process and found that the proposal could not proceed. So what other proof do you need? The National Energy Board went to meet with the former Premier of Quebec, Jean Charest, in private, in his office, to find out how they could deal with the Energy East project. These people's only job is to evaluate the public testimony and to come up with a decision based on what was heard, and to do so pursuant to the existing rules. And yet they had already decided in advance what they would decide. Generally speaking, I think it's wrong to decide that a project can't go forward in advance. And just as it's wrong to decide that a project should go forward in advance. This happened to me only once in my career when I refused to consider a project. Now, this was a different project in the St. Lawrence, and it was a project called Rabaska, across from Quebec, which aimed to set up new shipping standards for liquefied natural gas so that it could be processed in Quebec. It made absolutely no sense, and I said that I would not study the project. I was one of those who said that when it came to the Douglas Channel near Kitimat in northern BC, and I went there and visited it because I really wanted to see the situation myself. So I went to visit the Douglas Channel with my friend and colleague who represents that part of BC, the member for Skeena-Balti Valley. And I saw myself the foolishness of this idea of having huge ships, huge oil tankers passing through these channels. So sometimes it is reasonable to say, no, we're not even going to study this project. But how is it that the Liberals had the NEB report on this project, the Trans Mountain Project, in their hands? And now there were two projects, one in northern BC, the other one in the south, and they had two reports from the National Energy Board. And they said that in the case of the northern pipeline concerning the Douglas Channel, that it wouldn't go forward because there had been no consultation with First Nations, there was no social license, and it just wasn't feasible. But for the southern project, they said, no problem. It makes no sense, Madam Speaker.
Reported that everywhere they went, there were issues with confidence, transparency, independence, safety, and security. The Kinder Morgan pipeline will not be going ahead because the Liberals did not respect their promise to British Columbians to bring in a new process that would be credible, thorough, transparent, and that the public could have confidence in. Without those key elements, none of these major projects can go ahead, because in this day and age, the public knows that we have an obligation not just to ourselves now, but to future generations. That is the essence of sustainability, and that's why the New Democratic Party will be opposing this motion, and we oppose the Kinder Morgan pipeline, Madam Speaker.
If
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Chilliwack Hope.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do always enjoy the Leader of the NDP's contributions to the debate in this House, and I think the NDP has always been clear on this pipeline, and certainly on any major pipeline that was proposed under the Conservative government. They were opposed to that pipeline. That was their position, and the member has just outlined the reasons for it. What I have more trouble with is the Liberals saying one thing when they're running for election and doing something else when they're in government. I think Canadians should be concerned about that, and having the Prime Minister say one thing and having Liberal MPs from BC say either the opposite or nothing, it appears will be the case. But I did want to ask him, and this is a sincere question. The NDP Premier of British Columbia, the NDP, not yet. The NDP Premier, I walked into that. The NDP Premier of Alberta has made it clear, she said, mark my words, this pipeline will be built. Obviously, John Horgan has said something else. And there's other, Tom Sigurdsson, Mike Harcourt, Dan Miller, other BC NDP luminaries who have said, we think this is good for the building trades, we think this should go ahead. So I do want to get his perspective on the comments of the Premier of Alberta and what he might say to her in opposing this project.
L'honorable député d'Outremont.
Honourable member for Outremont.
Colleague for his question. He's also from British Columbia, and he's looked at this for a long time. But let's not forget that it's not Rachel Notley who promised a new system to evaluate the Kinder Morgan project. It's the Prime Minister. He's the one who's breaking his promise, and that's why British Columbians, and that's why the NDP says that this project, Kinder Morgan, cannot go ahead, because it's never been studied in a thorough and credible manner. And I'd also add, and I think that Alberta has shown the way on this to many other provinces, that first of all, the Rachel Notley NDP government is the first one in the history of Alberta to come up with a plan to start bending the curve with regard to greenhouse gas production. They've put a hard cap. They brought together First Nations, business groups, non-government organizations. That's bridge building. I also like to see the NDP Premier, as he was just referred to, of BC, and the leader of the Green Party getting together. That's also bridge building. I'm sure with a lot of goodwill we can do a lot, including getting new jobs created in the new economy. It doesn't have to be based on those same resources of the past. We can do a lot, and the people of Alberta can be part of that.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to go back to my honourable member's original comment when he stood up and ask him if he purports to speak for all Indigenous groups, and if so, then what does he say to those Indigenous groups and communities who indeed support this pipeline? I also want to follow up on something the member from Chilliwack mentioned, and that was on the comment around Premier Notley, the NDP Premier of Alberta, who clearly supports this project. And I guess indeed I'd also like to ask the member opposite what he would say to those NDP members across Canada, indeed, who do support this pipeline, and to those workers, a lot of whom are represented, the 15,000 jobs we're looking at, a lot of those workers represented by trade unions who want these jobs because they're good middle-class paying jobs, and they are important to communities across this country. Thank you.
L'honorable député d'Outremont.
The honourable member for Outremont.
In the filings of Kinder Morgan with the National Energy Board, they didn't talk about 15,000. They talked about 50. Not 50,000, 50 jobs permanently created by that pipeline. So I don't know where the 15,000 comes from. But I would ask my colleague one thing. Why did she enter politics? I mean, does she feel good when she meets with a group in her riding and says, yes, we told the people of British Columbia that there would be a new process, but that was just something we were saying to get elected. We had no intention of doing it. Does that make her feel good about coming into politics, investing that much time and energy? I would feel terrible if I had ever done something like that. When I was the Minister of Environment, I was able to reduce greenhouse gases every year I was there. You know why? Because I went in with beliefs, with core beliefs of what was important in terms of sustainable development, and I dedicated myself heart and soul to respecting what I had promised people. People who get into politics making fake promises they have no intention of keeping, That is something that you should be ashamed of.
I just want to remind the member to address the comment to the chair and not use the word you. That would be a lot easier. Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Certainly appreciate the Member of Parliament for Richmond for his contributions in this place. Just in regards to the Kinder Morgan, the existing pipeline, it actually runs through my riding. Obviously, I'm a BC, Interior BC-based MP. And I have to say, Madam Speaker, I would like to see a new pipeline because it's 60-plus years old, and the design standards and requirements today are unparalleled considering the ones that this original pipeline was built under. Madam Speaker, by having a new pipeline that's built would allow for a greater amount of oil, but also that would also be able to pay for increases to safety and response time, Madam Speaker, and all the infrastructure that goes along with that. The member has also mentioned his issues with the credibility of the National Energy Board. Can he actually concretely say what elements that he would change, and why has not a member of Parliament put forward a private member's bill as to introduce that change so we can have that debate on whether or not that board can be tweaked in a way to build bridges, as he said. Thank you. And
The honourable member for Outremont.
Colleague for his question. When you know that the members of the National Energy Board who were hearing in the Energy East project actually sat down with Jean Charest and admitted, because they had to be replaced as they were in an obvious conflict, admitted that they were there to find out the best way to sell the project, and they hadn't even heard the evidence yet. They had already decided the results. So that's a bit of a problem for most Canadians if you're supposed to be in an adjudication process listening to evidence and you've already made up your mind in advance. I don't know about him, but I find that a bit of a problem. With regard to the changes that are necessary, there's just been another report brought in, and I will distance myself from one key element of that. I didn't think it made any sense whatsoever to say that the NEB can't sit in Calgary. I thought that was an absolutely unacceptable slight to the people of Calgary and to the ability of people to do their jobs. But the question is, what is necessary? You need a thorough, credible, transparent process. We don't have one. That's not just our opinion. It's the opinion of all the experts who have looked at it. We've got to replace the Energy Board with something that is credible. And you know why? Because if you don't, none of these projects, whether it's Energy East or Kinder Morgan, can go ahead. So if he believes in the sustainable and environmentally respectful development of our natural resources, which I repeat are a blessing, then he should get on board with trying to put in place something that the public can have confidence in. That's the nature of social license.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Liberal Minister of Natural Resources, when he spoke earlier, started his speech by saying he was in the uncomfortable position of agreeing with the Conservatives and that he had some soul-searching to do. Well, that's strange because Liberals so often agree with Conservatives when it comes to pipelines. And so if the expert panel that this Prime Minister appointed to review the National Energy Board came up with the following conclusions: that the public has fundamentally lost confidence in the National Energy Board, and that there is a, quote, crisis of confidence with respect to the decisions that are being made because the public, quote, overwhelmingly feels that the National Energy Board is a captured regulator. That means too close to industry, too often approving whatever it is that industry wants, leaving the public out. If that's the creation, and the promise was clearly made by the Prime Minister in order to get that social license, is that we have to restore and renew the NEB on this project before it gets approved. What situation do we have now? And he went into British Columbia a week after the election and said British Columbian voters, 60% of which voted for parties against this pipeline, and said that they were wrong. What message is this Prime Minister and his silent Liberal MPs from British Columbia actually sending to the people of my province?
The honourable member for Outremont in 41 seconds.
Skeena Bulkley Valley for that important question, because it really is the essence of what we're discussing here today. See, the Prime Minister said the process was broken. The Ministerial Review Panel on Kinder Morgan said the process was broken. And the expert panel on the NEB said the process is broken. So how come the Liberals now think the process is fine?
Reprise de débat, resuming debate. The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm very pleased to rise in the House today on behalf of the good people of Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola. I'd like to inform you, Madam Speaker, that I would like to proudly share my time with the Member of Parliament for Battle River, Crowfoot. Madam Speaker.
Order. I just want to remind the members of the NDP at this point that the House is still going on, and if they want to have conversations, they should actually have them on the in the lobby. The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now, before we begin this debate, I think it's first important for us to recognize why we're having it. We know that recently the BC Green Party and BC NDP did a backroom deal with the intent to form a government in my home province of British Columbia. Now, as part of this deal, it has been made clear that should a BC NDP, BC Green Party supported government come to power, it will use every tool at its disposal to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Now, on top of that, we know there are multiple Liberal members of Parliament from British Columbia who have publicly stated that they are opposed to the Trans Mountain Pipeline being built. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister was doing his cross-Canada feel-good tour. He conveniently skipped my home province of British Columbia. Now, that's a curious omission. There is no question when the Prime Minister is in Alberta, he is very committed to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. However, this same commitment, Madam Speaker, has not been demonstrated in British Columbia. These things all added up raise concerns to me and why I think we're having this debate today. And I'm going to do something a little unusual for an opposition member, Madam Speaker. I'm going to give some praise to the government. First, for approving the Trans Mountain Pipeline. However, I must add that while one of the Liberals' favorite talking point is how the former government did not get any pipelines built to Tidewater, to be clear, the National Energy Board did not greenlight the Trans Mountain Pipeline until the new government was in power. Now, on the same note, I will credit the government for keeping a campaign promise to reopen the Kitsilano Coast Guard Station, and at the same time, added spill response capacity to the station. I will recognize also that when the Prime Minister is in Alberta, stating the reasons why his government supports the Trans Mountain Pipeline, he does make a compelling case. Now, let us hope that more of this happens in British Columbia, where it is truly needed. So, now that I've given the government some credit where it's warranted, I'd like to add a few thoughts of my own on the topic. Now, to be clear, if the Trans Mountain Pipeline did not get built, it does not stop the flow of oil, so to speak. It simply guarantees that oil continues to go in the same direction across the same border where we yield a much smaller return. And let us be clear, the revenue and related taxation from resource royalties is part how governments at all levels provide critically needed services for our citizens. The question is ultimately where we send the oil to maximize the return for our citizens who we all collectively represent. Now, in Alberta, we have an NDP government that has paid a massive political price introducing some extremely unpopular environmental regulations and, to be blunt, carbon taxation in an effort to secure social license on pipelines. It has been a failed effort because those who oppose the oil sands will continue to oppose them regardless of what the Alberta NDP government does. However, here in this place, we have an obligation to represent our citizens in a manner that also strengthens the fabric and ultimately of the country, Madam Speaker, and ultimately the Canadian national interest. In British Columbia, there's an added concern over the presence of oil tankers off the west coast of Vancouver Island. Indeed, this Liberal government proposes to ban large tankers off the north coast of British Columbia. Now, I mention large tankers because, of course, the proposed legislation says smaller tankers are okay. Because even those who oppose tankers in the north coast still need them. So because of that, they get less efficient, smaller tankers. Now, getting back to tankers off the west coast of Vancouver Island, here's the thing. there is an international shipping lane off the west coast of Vancouver Island, and just across the border in south of Vancouver, British Columbia, is a place called Cherry Point, Washington, home of a massive refinery and a destination for all kinds of large-scale tanker traffic. Bottom line, tankers have been and will continue to ply the waters off of Vancouver Island regardless of any legislation passed in this place or in Victoria. The only question is, do we allow our resources to be discounted and our jobs lost solely because of some in the United States that have figured out a loophole where it is very easy to send large amounts of money into Canada to oppose Canadian oil, not USA oil, not Saudi Arabian oil, just oil from Canada. I would suggest, Madam Speaker, that is wrong, and is part of the many reasons why I support the Trans Mountain Pipeline. In fact, on a local level, some of the communities in my riding also publicly support the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Now, aside from the job benefits, they stand to get some taxation benefits from the improvements. For a community like Merritt, hard hit by the closure of the Toku lumber mill, these are critically needed jobs and revenues for local government. And on the bigger picture, I also believe there are times when we need to have a national vision and the leadership to see it through, because that's how we build a stronger Canada. We watch celebrities, Madam Speaker, who charter 100-foot yachts, who jet set around the world, who have carbon footprints hundreds of times the size of a normal, everyday citizen's, who just fly into Alberta, and they hire a local jet fuel-powered Bell helicopter and blast us for our oil sands. We see oil-producing countries with nowhere near the environmental regulation being implemented in Alberta getting a complete pass. Because here in Canada, we have become the low-hanging fruit of the anti-oil industry. And, Madam Speaker, it is an industry.
Hear, hear.
There is big U.S. money that flows across our border to fight Canadian oil.
Shameful.
USA oil production, we know, is massively on the rise, but strangely, there is mostly silence on that. By the way, most of that growth, Madam Speaker, was during the previous president. It's not just the current administration. So we have an opportunity today, Madam Speaker, with this opposition day motion. The Liberal government can support this motion. It is in our collective interest to do so. Crown resources ultimately belong to the people, and we have a duty, an obligation, to ensure we maximize the return on these resources to pay for the very services that Canadians hold near and dear. Because it is all well and good to offer $372 million to a carbon-burning aviation project for a private company in Quebec, and likewise $35 billion for an infrastructure bank for Toronto, and that money needs to come from somewhere. And here we have a project, Madam Speaker, not looking for a handout, not looking for a government guarantee on the money needed to finance the project. What they need, Madam Speaker, is not, again, handouts. They need to have certainty. In the time of need to build this project and put Canadians to work, they will have a federal government in Ottawa that will be there to help them, to help Canadians say yes. Now, I recognize this government itself so far has said yes, and words, Madam Speaker, are important. But so are actions. And by taking action today to support this motion, we'll send a message that we have a federal government who is not afraid to diversify our oil export market away from solely the United States, to allow us to get the full value of what everyone would agree on is a limited, finite resource. And when we send that message, We will create jobs and increase our future revenues. And given the large deficits of the government, Madam Speaker, and likewise many provincial governments, now is the time to take action and support Canadian oil produced by Canadians. Madam Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to stand on behalf of my constituents. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de Sherbrooke.
The honourable member for Sherbrooke.
Présidente, et je remercie mon collègue.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I would like to thank my colleague. What bothers me in the motion before us today is mention of social license, which presumes in this motion that social license has already been acquired. And yet, there are many who are fiercely opposed to this project, who have even started legal proceedings against it. And there are others who are strongly opposed to it as well. Why did they add this aspect to their motion regarding social license? The Conservatives seem to have indicated that this is no longer an issue, that social license is there, and that everything is fine. Why did they add this when it is clear that social license has not been granted?
Nicola.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate my colleague's question and his work on the Finance Committee with myself. What I would simply say, Madam Speaker, is I first heard of this term social license being used in the context of oil sands and pipelines actually from the Premier of Alberta, Premier Notley. And it's also been used by the Prime Minister. Madam Speaker, the problem with social license itself is it's a very loose term because it kind of creates a sense that somehow we can always build consensus. And in our modern society, we know we will not always have consensus. But what we can have, and the NDP, what does that stand for? New Democratic Party, should know better than anyone that ultimately we have democracy, where we cannot get past feelings and regrets and questions and whatnot. We have, when we have to come to decisions, Madam Speaker, we stand in this place, we vote and move forward. We have moderating institutions like courts to make sure that if people do have legitimate concerns, the government is trespassing into people's individual rights, there is recourse. That's democracy, Madam Speaker. I support democracy because it is something that every Canadian knows, understands, and I think respects.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development.
Thank you. And thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for his statement. During the last few months while we're in government, of course, we have approved pipelines to Tidewater. Our Minister of Natural Resources has been clearly working at approving these pipelines. Our Prime Minister has done so, respecting the fact that we know that the economy and climate action go hand in hand. And so I'm just wondering what our honourable colleague has to say about the fact that we have, as a government, been able to do them both together, the economy and the environment. And the previous government has made a number of different removals from our climate change policies. And I'm wondering what he thinks about that and why he's not satisfied with the actions that our government has taken so far, and hence has to bring this motion forward.
The honourable member for Central Okanagan-Similkameen.
Well, Madam Speaker, I guess it's because this is a new member and she's feeling the glow still from the previous election. She says it's been a few months since they've been governing. Madam Speaker, I think it's been more like a few years. That's what it feels like to me. Eternity. However, she does raise an interesting point. She says that they are taking actions for the environment and the economy. I would actually say they are actually doing the opposite on both. First of all, on the environment, what they've done, Madam Speaker, is they've put out a vague notion of a carbon tax, yet to be decided, and actually putting provinces and pitting them against the federal government. This is from a Prime Minister that said he would listen and work with provinces. Second to that, for the things they have, like methane regulations, you've actually pushed them back. 3 or 4 years of implementing, and many people in the environmental movement think that it's wrong what you're doing. The next thing I would just say, Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, you have the coal-fired, basically the banning of it. You've exempted Nova Scotia. You've exempted other provinces. So at the end of the day, you're not growing the economy very much. You're blowing a lot of money, and you're not actually doing the environmental things that they said they would, or else you wouldn't be getting raked over the coals by the NDP on a regular basis. Mr. Speaker, this government still may feel like it's a few months into it, but man, they have not done that much in 2 years.
Before we go to resuming debate, I would just remind the honourable member to direct his attention and language towards the chair as opposed to members opposite.
Mr. Speaker, that's great advice. I apologize to the chair.
Not a problem. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that resounding applause to my neighbour here. It's a real pleasure to stand in this House anytime and to represent the people of Battle River Crowfoot, to represent in a small part the people of Alberta and the people of Western Canada and Canada. And make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, this debate today is very important to all of those groups that I mentioned, whether it be the constituents of Battle River Crowfoot or even the broader constituents of Canada and probably around the world as well. This is also the very first Opposition Day debate in which our new leader of the official opposition and of the Conservative Party has brought forward or allowed a debate on this subject. And I can tell you that this bodes well for Alberta and for our country. The motion that we are debating today, Mr. Speaker, is very important for Canada's energy sector, and it's important for the wealth and prosperity of our country. Today's debate is important for every social program that we have in this country, and so the ramifications of a prosperous, forward-moving country benefits all. Mr. Speaker, the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project is critical to the Canadian economy and the creation of thousands of jobs. And that is one of the important aspects of the motion that we are debating today. Many Canadians understand the great promise of prosperity that Canada's energy sector has for our country. For the coming decades, the world is going to continue to need and want Canada's oil and gas. We see China and India move more and more to a need of what our country produces, and that is energy. And Canada, Mr. Speaker, is an exporting country. There continues to be markets around the world that want Canadian energy products. This will continue to be the case for decades to come. In fact, Mr. Speaker, when we look at the history of our country, we very quickly understand that Canada's prosperity historically has prospered because we've been able to provide the world with goods that they have needed and wanted. You go back to the very early days of Canada. Europeans asked for the fur, and we developed the fur trade. And this large geographic nation of Canada, whether it be through First Nations or our trappers and settlers, provided that fur around the world. Then coal. As people look for energy and look for home heating around the world and in our country, we required coal, and Canada responded and produced and exported that. Likewise with wheat, feeding the world. Today, the West and many all across the country continue to do that, but more recently, energy. Whether it be Canada's gas and oil sector, hopefully expanded LNG sector. As we look to the future, Mr. Speaker, we either have to decide, are we going to provide what the world is asking for, or are we going to withdraw into this little island and try to get by? The world was asking. There has been and it will continue to be more and more customers who want to purchase Canada's oil and gas. And yet our major customer, the United States, has now become our major competitor. And this is imperative to understand. We must prepare to transport our energy, our gas and oil, to markets offshore other than the United States. We want the United States market. We'll continue to sell into it, but we must realistically look and say we need more countries. We need to build the necessary transportation infrastructure that will ensure that we can export these products over the next 30 to 50 years. On November 29th, 2016, the Liberal government announced that they approved the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project. They were satisfied that they had achieved social license from Canadians to go ahead with this project. Canada's National Energy Board has recognized and accepted that this project is both safe and environmentally sound. Canadians can have jobs and a clean environment. I will say that the previous Conservative government was confident that this would be the National Energy Board's conclusion. We were already working on getting Canada's energy to the markets. This Liberal government has only delayed the progress that Canada has made. This project and others could be well advanced in their progress. Some could be completed by now. But we have to prepare. We have to look to the future, and we need to do this quickly to make these energy sales abroad. Previous government approved 4 pipelines: Keystone, the Alberta Clipper, Anchor Loop, and Line 9B. The Northern Gateway pipeline was also approved by the Conservative government. Construction would have started over a year ago. But the Liberals effectively cancelled the project by placing a moratorium on the transportation of crude oil by BC tankers. Did they study that? Did they work to reach a social license to go ahead with the projects that would help Canada's export its energy products? The answer was no. They just recklessly canceled things and laughed about leaving the carbon in the ground. By May of 2016, the National Energy Board had consulted 35 Indigenous groups and more than 1,600 different groups representing industry stakeholders, the public, and government. The National Energy Board approved Kinder Morgan, but the Liberals delayed the final decision to go ahead, and they were threatening not to proceed with it. Meanwhile, nearly 20,000 jobs have been lost in the natural resources sector since January 2016. Most of these jobs were in the oil and gas sector, most of them and pretty well all of them in Western Canada. Many of my constituents work in that sector. They work in the oil and gas sector. Some of them worked in oil sands. I met them when we were campaigning in 2015 in Camrose and Stettler, where they were waiting for the oil sands projects to get back going again. They traveled to Fort McMurray. They traveled and they worked, and it was worth it. Many of my constituency worked in support of the sector, and these jobs, most of them, are gone. We've lost them. We have lost many customers in the oil patch. We've lost the jobs associated with pipeline building. We've lost the customers who needed heavy machinery maintained. We have some locations with 10% unemployment in Alberta. In fact, my constituency, in the month of April, or in the month of March, had 9.9% unemployment. All through the recession, we had, and then the lead up to the recession, 3.2%. During the recession, about 4.5%. Today, in March, 9.9%. In April, 9.7%. And the NDP MLA from Camrose was bragging about the increase in employment in Camrose. Went from 9.9 to 9.7. Mr. Speaker, about the same time that the world oil prices fell and other factors played in to create a perfect storm that attacked Canada's oil sector, the Liberals were talking about everything but. Mr. Speaker, this government didn't come to the rescue of one of Canada's major export sectors. They did very little. They didn't help keep these jobs. They didn't help ensure that the sector remained prosperous. They actually lost revenues for their own government, and that continues to be the case. And all the while, they continue to borrow billions of dollars that Canadian taxpayers will have to pay back over the next few decades. Revenues from the oil and gas sector will help to pay back some of the billions of dollars in borrowed money. Our grandchildren will want to sell gas and oil to pay back the billions that this Liberal government has piled on in deficits and national debt. Our children will want to see jobs, and they want to see them soon. Mr. Speaker, we need pipelines. They are the safest, most efficient, and economical way to move gas and oil. Anyone who travels through the West now sees trains that seem like they're miles and miles long, carrying predominantly oil. Last month, or 3 weeks ago, in just outside Camrose, in my constituency, in a little town called Balf, I get a phone call. There's been a derailment. 29 cars have derailed. Wow, 29 cars. I'll tell you, I absolutely thought this is another disaster. There's going to be oil everywhere. Thankfully, that train was hauling grain, and the 29 cars. But make no mistake, the safest way to move our oil is not by train, it's not by rail, it is by pipeline. The 99.99% pipelines are absolutely safe, Mr. Speaker. And I think Canadians understand that. The question is, are we going to allow pipelines to be built to help our future? I thank the Liberal government from what it sounds like today. They are going to vote with us on this motion. They support the motion. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm also very aware that many of the Liberal British Columbian members of Parliament are not to be found in this place. And I think that's a sad commentary of where we are in this debate today. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for his comments. Although I do find something puzzling. He talked about the fact that China is currently in competition for production of oil. Yet the irony is that to that comment is that China actually is the world leader in renewable energy production. And as a matter of fact, China produces more than twice the amount of renewable energy that the United States does. China's renewable energy production outpaces its fossil fuel and nuclear capacity right now. So China, I think, sees the future at least. So my question to the member, and I accept the fact that he did mention in his comments that he saw oil as being extremely important for the next couple decades, he said. Where does he see the future after that? Does he see the future indefinitely in oil, or does he see it eventually going towards renewable energy like clearly China does?
Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I am very proud to stand in this place and say that I am a strong advocate for renewable energy. This is not an either-or. We will gladly encourage investment, by the private sector in renewable oils. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't have the statistics in front of me right now. Make no mistake, we know there will be a market for fossil fuels over the next 100 and some years. Given a complete revival in more renewable energy being brought forward, the most that it could do by most experts is up to 30%. We need to make sure that we invest in new renewable sources. He says China invests in renewable energy. Mr. Speaker, China is also the largest burner of coal. And every month are bringing forward more coal. So, I think we have to find that balance. We need to export. It used to be years ago when we looked at the CBC in China, you saw the old gentleman traveling down this rickety sidewalk on a bicycle. Now the Chinese want vehicles. They have 10 lanes of traffic. They are our customers. And they're not looking for only the renewable energy sector. They're looking for what's going to burn in that car. And there hasn't been yet a way to have a complete solar vehicle that satisfies any country's needs.
Question et commentaire. L'honorable député de Sherbrooke.
The honourable member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. I'd like to come back to a point I mentioned earlier when asking another colleague a question about social license. That's something that's mentioned in the motion. And perhaps this is the first time that Conservatives have even raised this concept of social license. But his Conservative colleague said that social license was a principle and that clearly it was important. And I'm paraphrasing what he said, but what he said was important. What was important was democracy, our democratic institutions, that make decisions, that voters go and vote, and that's how they express their opinion. So on that very point, in BC recently, we saw that 60% of voters supported a party that was opposed to the Kinder Morgan project in its current form, with the defective environmental assessment process that we currently have. So does he agree that 60% of voters are opposed to this project in BC? And if so, why are they pushing this forward when clearly there is no